The air in the Oakdale pharmacy always smelled like a mix of industrial floor cleaner and cheap peppermint. I stood at the counter, my work boots leaving faint, dusty outlines of coal grit on the linoleum. My back felt like a rusted hinge, a dull ache radiating from my tailbone up to my shoulder blades, the usual souvenir from a 12-hour shift 950 feet below the Earth's surface. I just wanted my blood pressure meds and a quiet seat on my porch. "That'll be $47.50, Mr. Donnelly," the clerk said. She was young, maybe 20, with a kind of bright-eyed energy that felt exhausting to look at after a day in the tunnels. I slid my debit card across the counter. It was a joint account card, the one Susan had insisted we use for everything to keep things simple. I didn't mind. After 38 years in the mines, I'd learned that simple was usually better. She swiped the card, a pause. She swiped it again. I saw her brow furrow as she looked at the little screen on the card reader. "I'm sorry, Stuart. It's been declined." I let out a short, dry laugh, the kind that kicks up a bit of dust in your throat. "That's not right. Try it again, honey." My paycheck hit the account on Friday. There should be a few thousand in there easy. She tried again. The machine let out a sharp, mocking beep. "Insufficient funds," she whispered, her voice softening with that terrible pity people reserve for old men whose lives are starting to fray at the edges. "Would you like to try another card?" I stared at her. I didn't have another card. I had $40 in my wallet for emergency gas, and that was it. I'd handed the keys to my kingdom to Susan 10 months ago, believing that a second marriage at 62 was about trust, about finally letting someone else hold the weight I'd been carrying since I was 18. I paid for the meds with my emergency cash and walked out into the biting October air. The sun was dipping behind the Appalachian ridges, casting long, skeletal shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my 2012 Silverado, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. $47. A card declined for $47 when there should have been at least $3,000 sitting in that account after the mortgage and utilities were paid. I lived a quiet life. I didn't gamble. I didn't have a boat. I didn't have a mistress. My only luxury was a good steak on Sundays and a fresh bag of coffee once a week. I pulled my phone out, my fingers still stained with the coal dust that never quite washes out of your cuticles. I opened the banking app. I'd rarely checked it. Susan handled the dashboard, as she called it. The screen flickered to life, the blue light harsh against the gathering dark. Current balance, $147.83. I felt the air leave my lungs. My vision blurred for a second, the numbers dancing on the screen. $147. I had earned over $80,000 in the last 10 months. I'd breathed in stone dust and diesel fumes. I'd felt the mountain groan above me. I'd worked double shifts until my hands cramped into claws, all for $147. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't. I drove to the Oakdale Credit Union and sat in the parking lot for an hour after they'd closed, just watching the streetlights flicker on. I was trying to find a reason, a logical explanation. Maybe a massive identity theft, maybe a banking glitch. But deep down, in that place where a man keeps the truths he's too afraid to voice, I knew. The next morning, I was at the credit union before the doors even unlocked. Angela Brooks, a woman I'd known since she was in pigtails, was the one who let me in. She saw my face and her smile faltered. "Stuart, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, leading me to her desk. "I need my transaction history, Angela," I said, my voice sounding like gravel being poured into a bucket. "The last 10 months. Every single penny that went out of the joint account." She started typing, and then the printer behind her began to whir. It didn't stop for a long time. It hummed and clicked, spitting out page after page after page. When the noise finally died down, Angela gathered the stack. She didn't look me in the eye when she handed it over. "It's 47 pages, Stuart," she said quietly. I took the folder to my truck. I sat there, the heater blasting, and I started to read. It wasn't a heist. It wasn't a single catastrophic theft. It was a slow, methodical bleed. It started small. $100 here at a spa. $200 there for online shopping. But then the numbers began to swell like an infected wound. January 15th, Breckenridge Mountain Lodge, $2,800. I remembered that week. Susan told me she was going to visit her sister in Ohio. She'd asked for gas money. Instead, she'd taken Lydia, her 26-year-old daughter who'd been finding herself in my guest room for the last year, on a ski trip I wasn't invited to. February 3rd, Valley View Spa, $450. February 17th, Valley View Spa, $450. Then I saw the names. Names that made my blood turn to ice. Venmo transfer to Derek Palmer, $500. Venmo transfer to Derek Palmer, $1,500. Venmo transfer to Derek Palmer, $800. I didn't know a Derek Palmer, but I knew Lydia spent a lot of time on her phone, giggling and retreating to her room whenever I walked in. Total transfers to this Derek character over 6 months? $16,400. My money, my sweat, my lungs. I saw charges for a Peloton bike that sat in the corner of our sunroom, draped with Lydia's laundry. I saw charges for a 70-inch television that I'd been told was a gift from Susan's mother. It wasn't a gift. I had paid for it twice over. But the thing that broke me, the thing that made the first tear track through the coal dust on my cheek, was the timing. There were transfers made at 2:47 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 4:10 a.m., while I was upstairs, sleeping the heavy, dead sleep of a man who had to be at the pit head by 5:30. They were awake, moving my life's blood into other accounts. They were waiting for me to close my eyes so they could pick my pockets. I sat in that truck for 3 hours. I did the math. The total amount missing, the amount they'd spent on spas, clothes, gambling apps, and some mystery boyfriend totaled nearly $80,000. My entire cushion, my retirement, everything I'd saved to ensure that when my body finally gave out, I wouldn't have to die in the dark. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen from decades of manual labor. I thought about the days I'd worked with a fever of 102 because we needed the overtime. I thought about the time the roof bolt had failed in Section 4 and I almost didn't come home to see the sun again. And for what? So Susan could have rose-colored lips and Lydia could fund a man who didn't have the decency to earn his own keep. I felt a change in me then, a hardening. It was the same feeling as when the pressure in a mine shaft shifts the silent warning that the mountain is about to move. I wasn't the man who'd walked into that pharmacy yesterday. That man was a provider. This man was a survivor. I walked back into the credit union. Angela was still at her desk, watching me through the glass. I want to open a new account, I told her. Individual, my name only, and I want to redirect my direct deposit immediately. Stuart, are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. Susan will find out the moment the next check doesn't hit. That's the point, Angela, I said, and I want you to do me one more favor. I want a copy of every single one of those 47 pages, stamped and certified. I have a feeling I'm going to need to prove exactly who I've been living with. The rest of the week was a blur of silence. I went to the mine. I did my job. I sat at the dinner table and listened to Susan talk about how stressed she was and how she needed another mental health day at the coast. I watched Lydia scroll through her phone, probably sending another $500 of my dollars to Derek. I didn't say a word. I was a ghost in my own home, waiting for Friday. Friday morning, the notification popped up on my phone. Direct deposit received, $3,400. Oakdale Credit Union. Individual account. I checked the joint account. Balance, $0.12. I went to work. I spent 12 hours in the deep, the darkness feeling more honest than the light of my own living room. When I drove home that evening, the house was glowing. It looked so peaceful from the outside. A nice rancher, a well-kept lawn, 2 cars in the driveway, a lie wrapped in a pretty bow. I stepped through the front door, and the air hit me. It was thick with tension. Susan was standing in the kitchen, her face a mask of fury I'd never seen before. Lydia was behind her, her arms crossed, looking at me like I was a bug she was about to squash. "Where is it, Stuart?" Susan screamed. Her voice was a jagged blade. "I went to buy groceries today and the card was declined. I checked the account and it's empty. What did you do with our money?" I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her. I walked to the hallway table, set down my lunchbox with a heavy metallic clang, and pulled a thick manila folder from my work jacket. "Our money?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "That's a funny way to put it, Susan. Don't you get smart with me," she yelled, stepping into my space. "We have bills. We have a life. You can't just move money without talking to me. That's financial abuse." I finally looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the expensive highlights in her hair. I saw the designer sneakers on Lydia's feet. I saw the betrayal etched into every luxury they'd bought with my sweat. "Financial abuse," I repeated. I laid the 47 pages on the table, spreading them out like a deck of cards. "Let's talk about abuse, Susan. Let's talk about 47 pages of it." Their faces didn't just go pale. They turned bone white. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Lydia reached for one of the pages, her hand shaking. "I didn't know it yet," I said, leaning over the table. "But I was just getting started. You thought I was an ATM. You thought I was too old and too tired to notice. But you forgot one thing about minors, Susan. We spend our whole lives looking for the truth in the dark. And I've found everything." I tapped the page with Derek Palmer's name on it. "Who's Derek, Lydia? And does he know he's being funded by a man who's about to lose his patience?" Lydia looked at Susan. Susan looked at the floor. The ambush they'd prepared for me had crumbled in 10 seconds, but I could see the wheels turning in Susan's head. She was a manipulator. She was going to try to flip the script. She was going to try to make me the villain. I stood up straight, my back popping painfully. "You have until tomorrow morning to explain every single cent on these pages," I said. "If you don't, well, I've already spoken to a lawyer. And he's very interested in that ski trip you took to Ohio." I walked toward the stairs, but I stopped at the bottom step. I didn't turn around. "Oh, and Susan, I'd start packing Lydia's things tonight. This house is about to get real crowded with the truth." I went upstairs and locked my door. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of the mountain on my chest. But as I lay there, listening to them whisper frantically downstairs, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first shift. And the deeper you dig, the more likely the whole thing is to cave in. The sun didn't so much rise the next morning as it did leak through the gray Appalachian mist, pale and sickly. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those neat, black and white columns of numbers dancing against my eyelids. $80,000. In the darkness of my bedroom, I'd done the math again. That wasn't just money. It was 5,000 hours of my life spent in a place where the sun never shines, breathing in air that was trying to kill me. It was every missed birthday, every holiday worked for triple time. Every morning I'd woken up and had to peel my stiff, swollen fingers off the bedsheets. I heard the floorboards groan in the hallway. Soft, tentative footsteps. They were awake. They'd probably been awake all night too, huddling in Lydia's room like two conspirators trying to figure out how to patch a dam that had already burst. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. It was of my first wife, Martha. She'd passed 5 years ago from cancer. We'd spent 30 years together, and in all that time, we never had a secret bigger than a hidden Christmas present. We'd built this life brick by brick, cent by cent. When I met Susan at a community bake sale 3 years ago, I was a man wandering through a house that felt too big and too quiet. She was vibrant. She laughed at my dry jokes and didn't seem to mind the coal dust that seemed permanently etched into the creases of my forehead. She made me feel like I wasn't just a retired man in waiting. I was a fool, I realized now. A lonely man is an easy target, and Susan had hit the bullseye with surgical precision. I opened my door and walked toward the kitchen. The smell of stale coffee and something sweet hung in the air, Lydia's expensive scented candles, no doubt. I found them at the kitchen table. The 47 pages were still there, but they'd been shuffled, sorted, and some of them had yellow highlighter marks on them. They were preparing a defense. "Stuart," Susan said, her voice soft and trembling. She'd put on her vulnerable face, no makeup, hair slightly messy, a soft pashmina wrapped around her shoulders. "Please, sit down. Let's talk about this like family." "I'm done sitting, Susan," I said, leaning against the counter. I didn't pour coffee. I didn't want to share a ritual with them. I want to know where the money is. Not the money you spent on the ski trips or the spas that's gone. I want to know about the transfers. Who is Derek Palmer, and why did he get $16,000 of my pension? Lydia flinched. She was staring at her manicured nails, her lip quivering. "He's my friend, Stuart. He was in a bad spot. His business. It was struggling." "A business?" I let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "I looked him up on my phone last night, Lydia. Derek Palmer doesn't have a business. He has a rap sheet for petty larceny and a history of consulting for online sports books. You weren't helping a friend. You were funding a gambler. It was an investment." Lydia snapped, her true colors leaking through the tears. "He was going to pay it back with interest. We were going to surprise you with the profit." "An investment," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Using my money. Without my knowledge." In the middle of the night, I turned to Susan. "And you? You watched her do it? Or were you too busy getting your toes painted with the money I earned drilling roof bolts?" Susan reached across the table, trying to grab my hand. I pulled it back. Stuart, honey, I was overwhelmed. Taking care of this house, looking after my mother's medical bills, trying to give Lydia a head start. It just got away from me. I thought I could balance the books before you noticed. I was going to tell you. When, Susan? When the balance hit zero? When the bank came to take the house I paid off 10 years ago? You're being dramatic, she whispered, her eyes flashing with a sudden sharp coldness. We're talking about money. It's just paper. We have a marriage. We have a home. You can't throw away 3 years over a few bad financial decisions. 80,000 bad decisions, I corrected her. I looked around the kitchen. I'd remodeled this room for Martha back in '95. I'd laid the tile myself. Every corner of this house had my fingerprints on it. And for the last year, these two women had treated it like a luxury hotel they were looting before checkout. I realized then that the red flags had been there all along. I'd just chosen to call them personality quirks. Like the time Susan insisted on upgrading our internet to the most expensive package so she could work from home, even though her job at the library only required a library card and a sense of shushing. Or the way she'd suggested I stop checking the mail because the bills were stressful and she'd handle them. I'd thought she was being kind. I'd thought she was protecting me from the mundane headaches of life so I could focus on the mine. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first loop they'd slipped around my neck. I went into the workshop this morning, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I noticed my power saw was missing. The DeWalt, the one I've had for 12 years. Lydia went incredibly still. I checked the garage too. I continued. My father's old tackle box, the one with the brass fittings. It's gone. Where are they, Lydia? I thought you didn't use them anymore, she stammered. I sold them on Marketplace. We needed the cash for the electric bill last month because your paycheck was late. My paycheck was never late, I growled. You sold my father's belongings to pay a bill because you'd already sent the grocery money to your gambling boyfriend. The realization hit me like a roof fall. They hadn't just been spending my income, they'd been liquidating my life. They were stripping the copper out of the walls while I was still living inside them. Get out, I said. It was a whisper, but it filled the room. Stuart, you can't be serious, Susan said, standing up. This is my home. I'm your wife. You're a tenant who's been stealing from the landlord, I said. And Lydia? Lydia is a guest who's overstayed her welcome by about 17 months. I'm giving you 21 days. 3 weeks to find a place, pack your things, and disappear. You can't kick us out, Lydia screamed. I have rights. This is my legal residence. Then you can explain those rights to the sheriff when I file the police report for the $16,000 in unauthorized transfers, I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from her face. And Susan? I'm calling the bank back this morning. I'm flagging every single one of those Venmo transfers as fraudulent. If Derek Palmer wants to keep that money, he can explain to the fraud department why it was sent from a joint account at 3 a.m. Susan's face crumpled. She knew what that meant. If I flagged the transfers, the bank would claw the money back, and Derek, the man Lydia was so desperate to impress, would be left in the lurch with a very angry sportsbook breathing down his neck. You'll destroy her life, Susan hissed. She's been destroying mine for 10 months, I replied. I'm just returning the favor. I walked out of the kitchen and into the workshop. I needed to be surrounded by things that made sense: wood, steel, oil. I sat on my stool and looked at the empty spot where my DeWalt saw used to be. It felt like a punch to the gut, but as I sat there, the anger began to cool into something much more dangerous: calculation. I'm a miner. We don't just dig, we shore things up. We brace the ceiling so it doesn't crush us. I realized that if I just kicked them out, they'd go to Susan's mother, Dorothy. Dorothy was a piece of work herself, a woman who'd spent her life marrying for money and teaching Susan to do the same. If they went there, they'd spend the next 6 months dragging my name through the mud in this town, making me out to be the toxic old man who abandoned them. I needed more than just them gone. I needed them to understand the weight of what they'd done, and I needed to make sure they could never do it to anyone else. I pulled out my phone and dialed Marcus, my shift lead and my best friend for 30 years. Marcus, I said when he picked up, I need you to do me a favor. You still got that nephew who works in digital security? The one who helps the cops with data recovery? Yeah, Stuart. Why, you get hacked? Something like that, I said, looking through the workshop window at the 2 cars in the driveway, both of them newer than mine, both of them paid for with my overtime. I need to find out exactly where that $16,000 went, and I need to see what else they've been doing on that home computer while I was underground. I'll send you his number, Marcus said, his voice turning serious. You okay, Stu? You sound different. I'm fine, Marcus. I'm just doing some deep-sea mining. Sometimes you have to go through a lot of dirt to find the structural damage. I hung up and looked at the door leading back into the house. I could hear them whispering again. The panic was setting in. Good. Panic makes people move fast, and fast people make mistakes. What I didn't know yet was that Susan had a backup plan of her own. She wasn't just spending my money. She'd been preparing for the day I'd eventually wake up. As I walked back into the house to grab my keys, I saw Susan on the phone in the hallway. She didn't see me. Her voice was a low, hurried hiss. "He knows," she was saying. "He knows about the transfers. We need to move the rest of it now, before he freezes the secondary account." Secondary account. My heart stopped. I didn't have a secondary account. I backed away into the shadows of the mudroom, my pulse hammering in my ears. They hadn't just drained the joint account. They had another one, a place where they'd been siphoning the surplus they hadn't spent on spas and clothes. I thought I was at rock bottom, but as I watched Susan's face, the calculating, cold look of a woman who was still playing the game, I realized I hadn't even scratched the surface of the betrayal. The 21 days weren't just a countdown for them to leave. They were a ticking clock for me to find out how deep this tunnel really went before they buried me alive. What happened next? I whispered to the empty mudroom. Changed everything. The floorboards in the mudroom felt like they were vibrating beneath my boots. I stayed frozen in the shadows, my lungs barely expanding, listening to the sharp, frantic rhythm of Susan's voice in the hall. Secondary account. The words felt like a physical blow to the stomach. I'd spent 38 years dealing with the weight of the earth above me, but that was a weight I understood. You timber it, you bolt it, you respect it. But this was a different kind of pressure. This was the weight of a life built on a foundation of sand. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat toward the kitchen, the familiar click-clack of her heels shoes I'd bought her for her birthday sounding like a countdown. I slipped out the back door, the screen door whining on its hinges, and walked toward the workshop. I didn't go inside. I just leaned against the weathered wood siding and breathed in the scent of damp earth and coming winter. My mind raced back to 2 years ago. I'd been so damn proud to bring Susan into this house. After Martha passed, the silence here had become a deafening roar. Every empty chair was a reminder of what I'd lost. When Susan walked in with her bright scarves and her talk of filling the house with light, I didn't just open the door, I threw it off the hinges. I remember the day she suggested we consolidate. "It's about being a team, Stuart," she'd said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear while we sat on the porch. "One pot, one goal. It shows we're fully committed." I'd felt a swell of warmth then, thinking I'd found a partner who wanted to protect our future as much as I did. I was a fool. Looking back, I could see the team was just a front for a harvesting operation. She wasn't building a life with me, she was strip mining me. I pulled out my phone and looked at the number Marcus had sent. "Leo." I tapped the screen. "Leo, this is Stuart Donnelly, Marcus's friend." "Hey, Mr. Donnelly. Uncle Marcus told me you might call." He sounded concerned. "I need your help, son. I need to know what's happening on my home network, and I need to find an account I didn't know existed." "I can come by tonight," Leo said, his voice dropping into a professional tone that reminded me of the safety inspectors at the mine. "But I'll need access to the router and any shared devices. And Mr. Donnelly, if you're looking for hidden money, look for the ghost apps. Secret calculators, fake vault apps. That's where people hide the trails these days." I told him I'd meet him at a diner in town first. I didn't want him coming to the house yet. I needed to keep my cards close to my chest. When I walked back inside, the atmosphere had shifted again. Susan was at the stove, the smell of frying onions filling the air. It was a domestic scene that would have fooled anyone else. She looked up, her face a mask of practiced serenity. "I'm making your favorite, Stuart. Liver and onions. I thought maybe we could have a quiet dinner. Just us. No talk about, you know." "I've got an errand to run," I said, my voice flat. "On a Saturday evening? You've worked 60 hours this week, honey. You need to rest." "Rest is for people who have peace of mind, Susan," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm fresh out of both." I saw the flash of irritation in her eyes, the real Susan peeking through the loving wife costume. I didn't wait for her to respond. I met Leo at the back booth of the Silver Spoon. He was a skinny kid, barely out of college, with a laptop bag that looked like it weighed more than he did. He listened as I explained the secondary account I'd overheard her talking about. "If she's moving money fast," Leo said, tapping a rhythm on the table, "she's using a digital wallet. Give me your phone." If your home Wi-Fi is linked, I can see the traffic logs from the last 48 hours. I handed it over. For 20 minutes I watched his fingers fly. The diner was noisy truckers complaining about diesel prices, a jukebox playing old country, but I felt like I was in a vacuum. "Okay," Leo said, turning the laptop toward me. "I can't see the balance, but I see the destination. It's an offshore-linked neobank. The account holder isn't Susan Donnelly. It's registered to a DP Holdings." "DP," I whispered. "Derek Palmer." "There's more," Leo said, his face clouding. "I looked into the IP addresses accessing your home network. There's a device that's been connected for 6 months, nearly every day from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's not your phone, not hers, not Lydia's. It's his," I said, the realization settling in like a heavy fog. "He's been in my house. While I was underground, he was sitting in my living room. Looks like it. And Mr. Donnelly? I found a series of outgoing emails from the home computer. They're encrypted, but the headers are visible. They're all going to a real estate firm in the city. Oakdale Rancher final appraisal." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Appraisal? For what?" "It looks like someone was trying to pull a home equity scam. They weren't just spending your cash, Stuart. They were trying to build a file to take out a second mortgage in your name." I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just looting the house. They were trying to steal the ground I stood on. If they'd succeeded, they'd have walked away with a 6-figure check, leaving me with a debt that would have forced me back into the mines until the day I dropped dead. "I need you to block it," I said, my voice shaking. "I need you to lock every digital door in that house." "I can do better than that," Leo said with a grim smile. "I can set up a mirror. Every time a device on that network sends an email or moves money, a copy goes straight to this secure drive. You won't just know what they're doing, you'll have the evidence for the police." I thanked him and paid the bill, but as I drove back to the house, the backstory of my marriage started to rewrite itself in my mind. I remembered Susan's mother, Dorothy. She'd come over for dinner 6 months ago, looking me up and down like I was a prize heifer. "You've done well for yourself, Stuart," she'd said, sipping the expensive wine Susan had bought. "It's a shame this house is so under-leveraged. You could be doing so much more with the equity." I'd laughed it off then. I didn't believe in debt. My father had taught me that a man who owes nothing is a king. But Susan had spent the next 3 months dropping hints about renovations and investing for our golden years. I'd ignored it all, thinking I was being the steady hand. I didn't realize she was trying to pick the lock on my life. When I walked through the front door, the liver and onions were cold on the table. Susan and Lydia were on the couch, their heads huddled together over a laptop. They snapped it shut the moment I entered. "Found what you were looking for?" Susan asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "I found exactly what I was looking for," I said. I walked straight to the router in the hallway, pulled the power cord and tucked it under my arm. "Stuart!" "What are you doing?" Lydia yelled, jumping up. "I'm in the middle of a project. The only project being worked on in this house from now on is moving out," I said. "The internet is off, the joint account is frozen, and tomorrow morning, I'm changing the locks on the workshop and the garage." "You can't do that," Susan screamed, her face contorting with rage. "I have legal rights to this house, and I have 47 pages of bank statements that say you're a thief," I countered. "But here's the thing, Susan. I'm a fair man. I'm still giving you your 21 days. But if I see one more DP Holdings transfer, if I find one more piece of my property missing, those 21 days become 21 minutes. Do you understand me?" Lydia started to wail, a high, thin sound that felt like a drill in my ears. Susan just stared at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of losing me. It was the fear of a predator who'd just realized the trap had snapped shut on her own leg. I went to my room, but I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dark, watching the red light on my phone. An hour later, it buzzed. A notification from the mirror Leo had set up. Outgoing message detected cellular data to Derek Palmer. I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. "Susan, he knows about the DP account. He took the router. We have to do it tonight. Use the spare key in the shed. I'll leave the back door unlocked. Just take the box and go. He won't notice until morning." The box. I didn't know what was in the box, but I knew where the shed key was, and I knew that Derek Palmer was on his way to my house. I reached into my nightstand and pulled out the old iron key to the basement. I didn't own a gun, I didn't believe in them, but I had a 36-inch pipe wrench in the mudroom that had seen me through 3 decades of mechanical failures. I sat there, listening to the wind howl against the window, waiting for the sound of a motorcycle or a quiet footfall on the porch. I'd thought I was just fighting for my money. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized this wasn't about the $80,000 anymore. This was about the fact that they were bringing a stranger into my home to finish what they'd started. What happened next didn't just change the game, it ended it. The house felt like it was holding its breath. I sat in the darkness of the mudroom, perched on a wooden stool I'd built myself 20 years ago. In my hand, the weight of the 36-inch pipe wrench felt familiar and grounded. It was a tool of repair, but tonight, it was a tool of protection. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. I knew every creak of these floorboards, every groan of the joists. I'd lived here longer than Susan and Lydia had been a part of my consciousness. This wasn't just a building, it was my sanctuary, and the air felt thick with the looming violation. I heard at first the low, guttural thrum of a motorcycle engine being killed at the end of the driveway. Then, the silence returned, sharper than before. A few minutes passed. Then, the sound of boots on the gravel. They were cautious, but not quiet enough. I heard the faint clink of the shed key being retrieved from the magnetic hideaway box I'd kept under the potting bench for a decade. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands remained steady. 38 years in the mines teaches you one thing above all else. Panic is what kills you. You stay calm, you breathe, and you wait for the pressure to equalize. The back door lock clicked. The door swung open, a sliver of moonlight spilling across the linoleum. A shadow stepped in, tall, lean, wearing a leather jacket that creaked with every movement. He didn't see me in the corner. He was focused on the kitchen, moving toward the pantry where I kept the small, fireproof floor safe hidden beneath a false bottom in the cabinet. I waited until he was on his knees, reaching into the darkness of the pantry. Looking for something, Derek? I flipped the switch on the wall. The harsh overhead fluorescent light hummed to life, bathing the kitchen in a sterile white glare. Derek Palmer scrambled backward, his heels skidding on the tile. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, with a patchy beard and eyes that darted around like a cornered rat. He wasn't a professional thief. He was a punk who thought he'd found an easy score in an old man's house. Whoa, man. Take it easy, he stammered, holding his hands up. Susan told me to come get some things. She forgot her jewelry box. The jewelry box is in the bedroom, Derek, I said, stepping out of the mudroom, the wrench held loosely at my side. The safe you were reaching for contains my birth certificate, my deed, and the gold watch my father received after 40 years in the pit. None of those belonged to Susan. Stuart. I turned. Susan and Lydia were standing at the top of the stairs, both of them in their silk robes, the ones bought with my overtime pay. Susan didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. The vulnerable wife act was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp arrogance that made my skin crawl. Derek, just get the box and let's go, Susan said, her voice echoing down the stairs. He's not going to do anything. He's just an old man with a wrench. An old man who owns this house, Susan, I said, and an old man who's currently calling the police. Lydia laughed, a shrill, ugly sound that cut through the tension. Go ahead, Stuart. Call them. Tell them you're threatening my boyfriend with a weapon. Tell them how you're keeping our legal property from us. We'll see who they take away in handcuffs. The manipulation was so casual, so practiced, it made my head spin. For months, they'd been whispering in the dark, weaving a web of lies so thick they'd started to believe them themselves. They truly thought they could gaslight a man who'd spent half his life distinguishing between solid rock and a false ceiling. Is that the plan? I asked, looking up at them. A domestic violence call? You think the sheriff, who I've known for 30 years, is going to believe I just snapped? In this town, in this climate? Susan sneered, walking down the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace. An aging miner with respiratory issues and a failing memory. People will say the stress finally got to you. They'll say you were becoming unstable. I've already mentioned it to the neighbors, Stuart, how you've been confused lately, how you've been lashing out. I felt a chill that went straight to the bone. She hadn't just been stealing my money, she'd been poisoning the well. She'd been preparing a narrative to strip me of my sanity if I ever tried to fight back. You're a monster, I whispered. I'm a woman who knows how to survive, she countered. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood next to Derek. Now, give him the key to the safe. We're taking what's ours, and we're leaving tonight. You can keep your dusty house and your coal-stained memories. We want the liquid assets. Liquid assets? I asked. You mean the 16,000 you already sent to this loser, or the 80,000 you've bled out of our life savings? That was just the start, Lydia piped up, joining them in the kitchen. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated loathing. You have no idea what you're worth, Stuart. You're just a walking pension. You're a paycheck that smells like diesel and sweat. Did you really think Mom loved you? She hated the way you smelled when you came home. She used to make me spray the couch with Lysol after you sat on it. The words hit harder than any physical blow. I thought about all the times I'd come home, exhausted and aching, and Susan had met me with a hug. I'd thought it was affection. Now I realized she was just checking to see how much of the mine I'd brought back with me so she could clean up the mess. I was a nuisance to them, a dirty, necessary chore that provided the lifestyle they felt entitled to. You're right about one thing, Lydia, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and heartbreak. I don't know my own worth, because I spent too much time giving it to people who didn't deserve a second of it. I looked at Derek. He was eyeing the wrench, his muscles tensed to lunged. He thought he was faster. He thought he was stronger. Derek, I said, my tone shifting to something deathly quiet. You want to know what's in that safe? It isn't just gold. It's the original paperwork for the house, the deed that has only my name on it, and it's the legal power of attorney Martha gave me. But more importantly, there's a small digital drive in there, a drive that contains every single IP address and timestamp of your consulting work from my home network. Derek's face went from cocky to ashen in a heartbeat. He looked at Susan, then back at me. I don't know what you're talking about, he munted. I think you do, I said. Leo is a very thorough kid. He found the mirror accounts. He found the links to the offshore betting sites you've been running out of my spare bedroom. You weren't just taking my money, you were using my home as a hub for illegal gambling. If I call the cops, they won't just be coming for a domestic dispute. They'll be coming with a warrant for federal wire fraud. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Susan looked at Derek, her eyes wide. She hadn't known the extent of his business. She'd been so blinded by her own greed that she hadn't realized she'd let a federal crime into the house. Derek? Susan whispered. What is he talking about? Derek didn't answer. He backed toward the door, his eyes fixed on me. I'm out. I didn't sign up for this. You said he was a gimp. You said he was just some dumb dirt digger. Derek, wait, Lydia cried, reaching for his arm. He shook her off and bolted out the back door. A moment later, the motorcycle roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as he tore down the driveway, leaving the three of us in the stark, white light of the kitchen. Susan turned on me, her face contorted into something subhuman. You ruined it. You ruined everything. No, Susan, I said, finally setting the wrench down on the counter. I just turned the lights on. The cockroaches are the ones who ran. You think you've won? She hissed, stepping closer. I'm still your wife. I'm still on the deed to the contents of this life. You can't just erase us. Watch me, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I hadn't been calling the police. I'd been recording. I have everything you just said, Lydia. The walking pension comment, the Lysol, the admission that you were trying to take the safe. And Susan, I have your admission that you've been lying to the neighbors about my mental health. That's called defamation. And in a divorce court, it's called evidence of bad faith. Susan's hands began to shake. She looked at the phone, then at the man she thought she'd broken. She saw the coal miner, the man who could endure heat, darkness, and pressure that would crush a lesser soul. Tomorrow morning, I said. The 21 days are canceled. You have until noon to get your essential things and get out. If you're still here when the sun hits the top of the ridge, I'm taking this recording and the D.P. Holdings files to the district attorney. You wouldn't, she whispered. You loved me. I loved a ghost, Susan, I said. And ghosts don't have a place in a house with the lights on. I walked past them, my heart heavy but my head high. I went to the front door and opened it, letting the cold mountain air sweep through the house. It felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in a year. But as I stood on the porch, watching the darkness, a thought occurred to me. Susan was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals don't just run, they bite. I didn't know it yet, but Susan had one more secret hidden in that 47-page trail. Something she'd done right at the very beginning. Something that made the $80,000 look like pocket change. As I heard her sobbing in the kitchen, a new notification chirped on my phone from Leo. Stuart, I just found a hidden file on the backup drive. It's an insurance policy, a big one, and you're not the one who signed for it. My blood ran cold. I realized then that they weren't just waiting for me to retire, they were waiting for me to die. The silence that followed the chime of my phone was louder than any explosion I'd ever heard underground. I sat on the edge of my bed, the screen's white light reflecting in the darkened glass of the window. My eyes scanned the file Leo had sent. It was a PDF, a formal life insurance policy from a company I'd never heard of, based out of a neighboring state. I scrolled down. Policyholder, Stuart Donnelly. Beneficiary, Susan Donnelly. Secondary beneficiary, Lydia Hayes. Then I saw the amount, $500,000. My breath hitched. In the mining world, we call that blood money. But it was the rider at the bottom of page 4 that made my stomach turn into a knot of ice. Accidental death and dismemberment, occupational hazard rider. It was a double indemnity clause. If I died in the mine, if a roof bolt snapped, if the methane levels spiked, if I was crushed by a continuous miner, the payout doubled, $1 million. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was good, a fine, flowing imitation of my own jagged script, the hand of a man who'd spent too many years gripping a drill and not enough holding a pen. But there was a tiny tremor in the S that wasn't mine. It was Susan's. I'd seen that same tremor when she signed the grocery receipts. She hadn't just been waiting for me to retire. She had been betting on my funeral. Every time she'd hugged me before I headed out for a double shift, every time she'd said, "Be careful down there, honey," she wasn't worried about my safety. She was checking the odds. She was looking at a man who was worth more to her as a memory than as a husband. I didn't know it yet, but the accidents had already started. I remembered 2 weeks ago. I'd been in the workshop, working on a heavy oak dresser. The ladder I'd used 1,000 times, the one I kept meticulously maintained, had suddenly given way. I'd fallen 6 feet, bruising my ribs and nearly cracking my skull on the corner of the workbench. At the time, I'd thought I was just getting old, getting clumsy. But now, I remembered seeing Susan standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me with a strange, unreadable expression. She hadn't rushed to help. She'd just asked if I was insured for falls. I stood up, my knees popping like dry twigs. I couldn't stay in this room. The very air felt poisoned. I walked out into the hallway, my boots heavy on the floorboards. I could hear them downstairs. No sobbing now, just the sharp, metallic clatter of silverware being thrown into boxes. The packing had begun, but it didn't sound like a retreat. It sounded like a ransacking. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down. The living room was a disaster zone. Susan and Lydia were moving with a frantic, ugly energy. They weren't just taking their clothes, they were taking everything that wasn't bolted down. Martha's heirloom vases, the silver set my mother had given us, the small hand-carved clock from our honeymoon in the Smokies. "That stuff stays," I said, my voice echoing down the stairwell. They both froze. Susan looked up, her eyes rimmed with red, her face twisted into a snarl that stripped away every ounce of the beauty I'd once thought I saw in her. "Like hell it does," she spat. "I've spent 3 years in this dump, Stuart. I've earned every bit of this. Consider it a down payment on the alimony you're going to owe me." "There won't be any alimony, Susan," I said, walking down the steps one at a time, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "Because in this state you don't get a dime when there's proof of grand larceny and insurance fraud." She stopped mid-reach for a crystal bowl. The word insurance hung in the air like a gas leak, invisible but deadly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. It was thin, brittle. 500,000, Susan. Or was it the $1 million payout for a workplace fatality that really got you excited? I reached the bottom floor and stood by the dining table, the 47 pages of bank statements still scattered there like the remnants of a lost war. I saw the policy, I saw the forged signature, and I saw the occupational hazard rider. Lydia stepped forward, her face flushed with a desperate, pathetic kind of rage. "You're crazy. You're just making things up because you're a bitter old man. Mom wouldn't do that." "Lydia, shut up," Susan hissed. She turned back to me, her chest heaving. "You can't prove I signed that. Anyone could have taken out that policy." "Maybe it was an automated offer from the union." "The union doesn't use a third-party carrier out of Delaware, Susan. And the union doesn't list your private DP. Holdings account for the premium withdrawals." I leaned in, the scent of the mine diesel and damp earth clinging to my skin, a reminder of the life she'd tried to trade for a paycheck. "I'm not just calling the cops tomorrow. I'm calling the insurance investigators. Do you know what they do to people who bet on their husband's death? They don't just take the money back. They build a cage for them." Susan slumped against the wall, the crystal bowl slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood. The sound was like a gunshot. Neither of us moved. "I was just trying to secure a future," she whispered, her voice cracking. You're 62, Stuart. Your lungs are half black. Your heart isn't what it used to be. I saw the way you looked after a shift. I knew you didn't have much time left. Why shouldn't we be taken care of? Because I'm still breathing, Susan. I roared, the sound tearing from my throat. I'm still here. I'm a human being, not a life insurance policy. I gave you a home. I gave you my name. I gave you every bit of the comfort I spent 40 years bleeding for. And you were counting the days until I died so you could spend the rest of it with a gambler in my guest room. The humiliation of it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made my vision swim. I'd been so proud to be the provider. I'd thought my hard work was a badge of honor. To them, it was just a slow-motion car crash they were waiting to profit from. Get out, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Not tomorrow. Not at noon. Now, take your clothes. Leave everything else. If I see you touch one more thing that belonged to Martha, I'm calling the sheriff and I'm playing the recording of Derek in the kitchen. It's 2 a.m, Stuart, Lydia shrieked. Where are we supposed to go? I don't care. Go to Derek, go to a motel, go to the gutter for all I care. But if you're still in this house in 10 minutes, I'm locking the doors and calling the law. Susan looked at me, searching for the soft touch she'd exploited for 3 years. She found nothing but the cold, hard grit of a man who'd spent his life digging through stone. She saw the end. They scrambled. It was a pathetic sight, 2 women who'd lived like queens on a miner's back, now stuffing clothes into garbage bags, their designer shoes scuffing the floor I'd polished. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the rustle of plastic and the heavy, ragged breathing of 2 predators who'd lost their prey. I stood by the front door, the 36-inch pipe wrench back in my hand. I wasn't going to use it, but I needed them to see it. I needed them to know the old man was done being a victim. As they hauled the last of the bags toward the driveway, Susan paused at the threshold. She looked back at the house, at the warmth and the security she'd traded for a chance at $1 million payout. You'll be alone, Stuart, she said, her voice dripping with a final desperate venom. You'll die in this house, and there won't be anyone here to hear your heart stop. You think you've won? You've just guaranteed you'll end up as nothing but a headline in the local paper. Old miner found dead. That's all you'll ever be. I'd rather die alone than live one more second with a woman who's already buried me in her mind, I said. I slammed the door and turned the deadbolt. Click. I watched from the window as Susan's Honda and Lydia's Mazda pulled out of the driveway, their headlights cutting through the mist before disappearing into the trees. The house was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. I walked back into the living room and sat in my chair. The broken crystal bowl lay on the floor, glittering like ice. I looked at the 47 pages on the table. I looked at the empty spaces where my father's things used to be. I'd won. They were gone. But as I sat there, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. I was 62 years old. My savings were gone. My trust was shattered. And according to the file on my phone, there was still the matter of the secondary account and the real estate appraisal. I realized then that Susan hadn't just left. She'd left a trail of financial landmines behind her. If she'd been trying to get a second mortgage, there was a high chance she'd already forged my name on a preliminary contract. I picked up my phone and called Leo. Leo, they're gone. But I need you to check the county recorder's office. Look for any notice of interest or lien filed against my address in the last 90 days. I'm on it, Stuart, Leo said. But wait, something just popped up on the mirror. Susan just sent a message to her mother, Dorothy. What did it say? It's just one sentence. He kicked us out. Call the lawyer. Tell him the plan is in motion. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. The plan. Susan hadn't just been stealing. She'd been preparing for the divorce. And in this town, with her mother's connections and the story she'd been telling the neighbors about my confusion, she wasn't going to just walk away. She was coming for the house. What happened next changed the stakes from a family squabble to a war for my very existence. I didn't know it yet, but the police were already on their way to my house, and they weren't coming to help me. The blue and red lights didn't flash with the rhythm of an emergency. They pulsed with the steady, cold heartbeat of an execution. It was 3:15 a.m. I was standing in my kitchen, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, watching the strobe effect dance against the oak cabinets I'd installed with my own 2 hands. I didn't move. I didn't hide. I stood there like a pillar of salt, watching 2 patrol cars pull into the driveway, followed by a silver Cadillac I recognized all too well. Dorothy, the matriarch of the grift. I opened the front door before they could knock. I wanted the cold air. I needed to feel the sting of the mountain frost to stay grounded. Officer Miller, a man whose father I'd worked with in the Section 4 pits for 20 years, stepped onto the porch. He looked pained, his eyes avoiding mine. "Stuart," he said, his voice low. "We got a call. A bad one." "I bet you did, Jim," I said, my voice steady. "Let me guess. I'm unstable? I've been threatening people with a pipe wrench? Maybe I finally lost my grip on reality?" Behind him, Susan and Lydia were huddled by the Cadillac, wrapped in blankets like refugees. Dorothy stood between them, her chin tilted up, looking at me with a triumphant, icy stare. She wasn't just a mother-in-law, she was the architect. "They filed an emergency protective order, Stuart," Miller said, pulling a folded stack of papers from his belt. "They're claiming physical intimidation and a mental health crisis. Susan says you've been hallucinating about missing money and that you chased them out into the night because you didn't recognize who they were." The sheer audacity of the lie made my head spin. It was perfect. They turned my discovery of their theft into a symptom of my deterioration. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't a victim of fraud. I was a ticking time bomb of senile rage. "Jim, look at me," I said, stepping into the light. "I'm as clear-headed as the day we broke the tonnage record in '08. I have the bank statements right here. I have a recording of Derek Palmer in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. I can't look at evidence right now, Stuart," Miller said, his voice tight. The judge signed the order. "It's a kick-out provision. You have 15 minutes to gather a bag. You have to vacate the premises until the hearing on Tuesday." Vacate? The word felt like a cave-in. "This is my house, Jim. Martha and I paid for this place in cash. I've lived here 30 years. If you don't come peacefully, I have to take you in for a psychiatric evaluation," Miller whispered, stepping closer so the others couldn't hear. "Don't give them that, Stuart. If you go to the hospital, you're proving her point. Pack a bag. Go to Marcus's place. Fight this in court, not in the driveway." I looked past him. Susan was watching me, a tiny ghost of a smile touching her lips. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd finally found the one thing a minor couldn't dig his way out of, the system. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I walked back into the house, my heart feeling like a lead weight in my chest. I grabbed my work boots, a few changes of clothes, and the manila folder. I made sure to grab the small USB drive Leo had given me. As I walked out, Dorothy stepped forward. "It's for your own good, Stuart," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You need help. We'll take care of the house while you're getting better." "You touch one thing in there, Dorothy," I said, my voice sounding like a grinding drill, "and I'll make sure the insurance fraud is the least of your worries." I drove to Marcus's in a daze. My best friend met me at the door in his long johns, a pot of coffee already brewing. He didn't ask questions. He just pointed to the guest room and said, "We start digging at dawn." But sleep didn't come. I sat in Marcus's kitchen, the USB drive plugged into his old laptop. I started looking through the files Leo had mirrored. I'd been so focused on the $80,000 and the life insurance that I'd missed the biggest trail of all. Susan hadn't just been spending my money, she had been cleaning it. I found a series of digital receipts for a company called L&S Boutique. It didn't exist in Oakdale. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, just like the insurance carrier. The online shopping charges weren't for clothes, they were invoices for consulting services that Susan was paying to herself. She'd been siphoning my paycheck into a business account, then using that account to pay for Dorothy's medical expenses. Except Dorothy wasn't sick. I checked the mirrored emails. There were dozens of messages between Susan and a real estate developer in the city. "Susan, the old man is getting suspicious. We need to fast-track the appraisal. If we can get the lien filed before the divorce papers hit, he'll have to sell just to cover the legal fees. My mother has the witnesses lined up to testify about his memory issues. The plan wasn't just to take my money. They were going to bankrupt me with a fraudulent legal battle, force a sale of the house, and buy it themselves through the boutique shell company for pennies on the dollar. They wanted the land. There had been rumors for years about a new bypass road coming through Oakdale, and my 3 acres sat right in the path of the proposed exit ramp. They weren't just thieves. They were speculators. They were gambling on the destruction of my entire legacy. "Marcus," I said, waking him up at 5 a.m. "We aren't just going to court on Tuesday. We're going to the state capitol." "Why the capitol, Stu?" "Because the local sheriff has to follow a judge's order," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen. "But the State Bureau of Investigation? They're the ones who handle corporate fraud and interstate insurance scams. and I think I just found the map to Susan's entire gold mine. I spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of data. With Leo's help over the phone, we traced the L&S boutique back to its true owner. It wasn't just Susan. It was a three-way split: Susan, Lydia, and a silent partner. Derek Palmer? No. The silent partner was the appraiser Susan had been emailing, a man named Vincent Vane. I knew that name. Vincent Vane had been the one who handled the estate of my neighbor, Old Man Miller, 2 years ago. Miller had lost his farm in a similar way: a messy family dispute, a claim of dementia, and a sudden, lowball sale to an anonymous developer. The hidden truth was finally glaring at me in high definition. This wasn't a crime of passion or a daughter's bad influence. It was a syndicate. Susan was a professional. She found lonely, aging men with high-value land, moved in, bled them dry, and used the legal system to finish the job. I was just the latest project. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd picked a minor. We're used to the dark. We're used to working in tight spaces where one wrong move means the end. And we're very, very good at finding the structural weakness in a wall. On Monday morning, 24 hours before my hearing, I sat in the office of a state investigator named Miller, no relation to the officer, but just as stern. I laid out the 47 pages. I played the recording of Derek. I showed him the forged life insurance policy. And finally, I showed him the link between Susan and Vincent Vane. "Mr. Donnelly," the investigator said, leaning back in his chair, "this is quite a haul. You've done more work than our field agents do in a month." "I've had a lot of time to think," I said, "and I want to make sure that when the ceiling falls, it doesn't just hit Susan. I want the whole mountain to come down on all of them." "What do you want us to do?" "I want you to wait," I said. "Tuesday morning, 9 a.m., the courthouse in Oakdale. They're expecting a broken old man who can't remember his own name. I want to give them exactly what they're looking for, until I don't." I walked out of that office feeling a strange, cold peace. My rock bottom hadn't been the night they kicked me out. My rock bottom was the moment I realized I'd let them make me feel small. But as I drove back toward Oakdale, watching the mountains rise up to meet the sky, I felt the strength of the earth returning to my bones. Susan wanted a show. I was going to give her a masterpiece. I headed to the local barber. I hadn't shaved in days. I looked ragged, tired, confused. I told the barber to just trim the edges, leave the hollow look in my eyes. I bought a suit that was a little too big, one that made me look like I was shrinking. When Tuesday morning came, I walked into that courtroom leaning heavily on a cane I didn't need. Susan, Lydia, and Dorothy were sitting in the front row, looking like a portrait of grieving family members. Their lawyer, a sharp-featured man in a $5,000 suit, looked at me with a smirk. He thought he was looking at a victim. He didn't realize he was looking at the man who had just rigged the explosives. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old, heavy paper, a scent that usually meant order and justice, but today felt like the inside of a coffin. I sat at the small table on the left, my hands trembling, half from the cold fury vibrating in my marrow and half from the act I was putting on. I leaned my weight onto the mahogany cane, my shoulders hunched in the oversized suit, looking every bit the confused and declining minor Susan had described to the neighbors. Across the aisle, Susan sat between her mother, Dorothy, and her sharp-tongued lawyer, a man named Henderson. Susan looked radiant in a modest navy dress, her eyes perpetually damp, the picture of a grieving wife, forced into a terrible position. Dorothy looked like a queen mother, her back straight as a spear, occasionally patting Susan's hand with a calculated grace that made me want to retch. They didn't see a man who had spent 48 hours in a war room with a digital security expert. They saw a spent force. They saw an inheritance in a suit. "Your Honor," Henderson began, standing with the casual confidence of a man who'd already won. "This is a tragic case. My client, Susan Donnelly, has spent the last 3 years caring for a man she loves deeply. But as the medical affidavits and neighbor testimonies suggest, Mr. Donnelly's mental state has deteriorated rapidly. His outbursts have become violent. He has begun hallucinating about financial conspiracies, chasing his family into the night with a heavy pipe wrench. For their safety, and for the preservation of the estate, we are requesting not only the permanent protective order, but the appointment of a temporary conservator to manage the household assets." The judge, a silver-haired man named Thorne, looked down at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Mr. Donnelly, you are appearing today without counsel. Do you understand the gravity of the motions being filed against you?" I let out a soft, rattling breath. I let my head bob slightly, like I was struggling to focus. I understand, Your Honor. It's just a lot of numbers, a lot of talk. I just want to go home." Susan let out a tiny, audible sob. Henderson nodded toward her sympathetically. "As you can see, Your Honor, he's barely present. He's a danger to himself and the property." Before we moved to the conservatorship, Judge Thorne said, "Mr. Donnelly, do you have anything to say in response to the allegations of physical intimidation?" I looked up. I let the confusion stay on my face for 3 more seconds. Then, I let it melt. I stood up, not leaning on the cane, but gripping it by the neck like a club. I straightened my back, the years of mining labor suddenly looking like armor rather than a burden. The shrunken look vanished. I stood 6'2", coal-hardened and clear-eyed. "I have a few things to say, Your Honor," I said. My voice didn't rattle. It boomed, the same baritone I used to command a crew of 20 through a tunnel collapse. But it's not about my memory. It's about 47 pages of bank statements, a forged life insurance policy, and a criminal syndicate operating right here in Oakdale. The air in the room didn't just change, it vanished. Susan's vulnerable face froze. Dorothy's eyes narrowed into slits. Henderson started to stand, his mouth opening to object, but I didn't give him the chance. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a new set of evidence," I said, walking toward the bench with a stride that had no trace of a limp. "These aren't medical affidavits from neighbors Susan manipulated with lies. These are certified digital logs provided by the State Bureau of Investigation." I handed over a manila folder, much thicker than the one I'd shown Susan in the kitchen. "In that folder," I continued, "you will find evidence of a shell company, L&S Boutique, registered in Delaware. You will find that this company has been the recipient of $80,000 of my personal funds over the last 10 months. You will also find a direct link between that company and an appraiser named Vincent Vane, the same man who, I believe, is currently under contract with my wife to undervalue my property for a forced sale." Henderson was on his feet now, his face a frantic shade of crimson. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the protective order. This is a desperate attempt by a mentally unstable man to—" "Sit down, Mr. Henderson," Judge Thorne snapped, his eyes glued to the documents I'd provided. He flipped a page, then another. He looked at the forged life insurance policy with the $1 million double indemnity rider. He looked at the mirror email Susan had sent to Derek Palmer and the appraiser. The silence in the courtroom was the kind of quiet you get right before a mountain shifts the weight of everything pressing down, looking for the weakest point. "Mr. Donnelly," the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "you're alleging that your wife and her associates were not only stealing your income but were actively planning to liquidate your home through a fraudulent appraisal and insurance scheme?" "I'm not just alleging it, Your Honor, I'm proving it. If you look at page 12, you'll see the DP Holdings transfers. Derek Palmer, the man Susan told the neighbors was a contractor, is actually a sports betting consultant who has been using my home network to run illegal offshore accounts. Susan and Lydia were his backers, using my money." I turned to look at Susan. She wasn't crying now. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She looked like a cornered wolf, her teeth practically bared. Dorothy was stone-faced, but I could see her fingers twitching on her handbag. They knew the old miner hadn't just woken up, he'd called in the cavalry. And finally I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room, "There's the matter of the accidents. The ladder in my workshop that was sabotaged. The confused reports Susan was making to the doctor while she was secretly spiking my morning coffee with high-dose sedatives she'd bought online. I have the blood test results from the SBI lab in that folder, Your Honor. I went to a private clinic in the city on Sunday. My system was full of benzodiazepines I've never been prescribed." A gasp went up from the small gallery. The few neighbors who had come to see the sad end of Stuart Donnelly were now staring at Susan in horror. "Stuart, you're lying," Lydia shrieked from the front row, jumping to her feet. "You're just a bitter, jealous old man. Mom did everything for you." "Lydia, sit down," Dorothy hissed, but it was too late. The mask had shattered. Judge Thorne didn't even look at her. He looked at the back of the courtroom. "Officer Miller, I believe there are some gentlemen at the door who would like to enter." The heavy oak doors swung open. 2 men in dark suits, the investigators I'd met with in the Capitol, walked in. Behind them were 2 more uniformed state troopers. They didn't go to me. They went straight to the front row. "Susan Donnelly? Dorothy Hayes?" the lead investigator asked. "You are under arrest for suspicion of grand larceny, insurance fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Vincent Vane was taken into custody 20 minutes ago at his office. He's already talking. The collapse was total. Susan didn't go quietly. She screamed. She cursed. She tried to lunge at me, her fingernails clawing the air until the troopers pinned her arms behind her back. "You think you're so smart," she wailed as they led her toward the door. "You're still going to die in that house alone. You're nothing without me. You're just a dirty, broken-down coal digger." "I might be a coal digger, Susan," I said, watching her go, "but I know how to find the rot before it brings the roof down." "And you? You're just another pile of tailings." Lydia was sobbing now, real, terrified sobs, as they let her out too. Dorothy, ever the professional, stayed silent, her head held high even as the handcuffs clicked shut on her wrists. She looked at me one last time, a look of pure, icy respect for a predator who had outplayed her. The courtroom cleared out. Henderson, the expensive lawyer, packed his bag without a word and practically ran for the exit. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. I sat back down at my table. My back ached. My lungs felt heavy. The adrenaline was leaving me, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. I had my house. I had my life. But the 3 years I'd given her, the trust I'd invested, that was gone forever, crushed under the weight of the betrayal. Judge Thorne stood up. He walked down from the bench and stood in front of me. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just put a hand on my shoulder. "Mr. Donnelly," he said quietly, "I've been on this bench for 20 years. I've seen a lot of people try to bury their loved ones for a paycheck. But I've never seen a man dig his way out with as much grit as you. The protective order is vacated. The house is yours. And I'll be making sure the district attorney fast-tracks the criminal trial." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said. I walked out of that courthouse and stood on the steps. The sun was shining, a bright, crisp autumn day. I looked at the mountains, the ridges that had been my workplace and my burden for 40 years. They looked solid. They looked real. I didn't go home right away. I went to the cemetery. I sat by Martha's grave for an hour just talking to the headstone. I told her I was sorry I'd let someone else into our house who didn't respect what we'd built. I told her I'd fixed it. When I finally drove back to the rancher, it felt different. It didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a building. I walked through the rooms, looking at the mess Susan and Lydia had left in their frantic attempt to loot the place. Broken glass, empty drawers, the smell of their expensive perfume. I opened every window in the house. I let the mountain air sweep through, carrying away the scent of the lies. I grabbed a trash bag and started clearing away the shattered crystal. I was 62 years old. I was starting over with a bank account that was nearly empty and a heart that was full of scars. But as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the first stars appear over the ridge, I realized something. I hadn't just won a court case, I'd won my soul back. The 21 days were over. The grift was finished. But as I looked at the dark woods at the edge of my property, I saw a pair of headlights pull into the driveway. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Marcus. It was a black motorcycle. My blood ran cold. Derek Palmer wasn't in the courtroom. He hadn't been arrested with the others. And as he killed the engine and stepped into the light of my porch, I saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. "You think you can just put my girl in jail and walk away, Stuart?" he asked, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "You have no idea what you just started." I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the money or the house. It was about what happens when you corner a man who has nothing left to lose but his pride. What happened next changed the ending of my story in a way I never saw coming. I didn't reach for the wrench on the porch table. I didn't retreat behind the screen door. I stood my ground, my shadow stretching long and thin under the yellow glow of the porch light, reaching toward the man who had been a ghost in my house for 6 months. Derek Palmer looked ragged. The cocky, sideways grin I'd seen on the doorbell camera was gone, replaced by the twitchy, hollowed-out stare of a man who had just watched his meal ticket get hauled away in a cage. In his hand, he wasn't holding a gun. It was a heavy industrial-grade bolt cutter, my bolt cutter, the one from the shed. The metal glinted like a predator's teeth. "You think you're a hero, Stuart?" Derek rasped, his voice cracking. He took a step onto the first porch stair, the wood groaning under his weight. "You think you won because you put 3 women in the back of a squad car? You have no idea what Susan had in motion. You destroyed a $500,000 deal. That was my future you just flushed down the drain. Your future was built on my lungs, Derek," I said, my voice low and steady, the sound of stone against stone. "And Susan didn't have a deal. She had a scam. There's a difference. The box, Stuart." Give it to me. I know it's in the house. Susan told me if anything went sideways, I should come and take it. It's my insurance. I looked at him, and for the first time I felt a strange flicker of pity. Not the kind you feel for a friend, but the kind you feel for a stray dog that's been kicked so many times it doesn't know how to do anything but bite. There is no box, Derek, I said quietly. Don't lie to me, he screamed, the bolt cutters shaking in his hand. She said it was in the floor safe. The files, the hard drive, the evidence on Vane and the others. She was lying to you, son, just like she was lying to me. Just like she was lying to herself. I took a step toward him, ignoring the way he tensed up. Think about it. Why would she tell you to come here tonight? She knew I'd be home. She knew the police were circling. She didn't send you here to get insurance. She sent you here to be the violent intruder in her next story. Derek froze. The tip of the bolt cutters dipped toward the porch floor. If you'd broken in and hurt me, or if I'd hurt you, it would have been the perfect mental health crisis she needed to win her appeal. I continued, my voice gaining strength. She was setting you up to be the final nail in my coffin. She didn't want you to have that box. She wanted you to be the distraction while she tried to make her escape. She loved me, Derek whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. She loved the $16,000 I earned 950 feet underground that she funneled into your pocket, I said. And the moment that tap ran dry, you became a liability. Look at your phone, Derek. Did she call you from the station? Did her mother reach out to make sure you were okay? Derek reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a burner phone. He stared at the dark screen for a long, agonizing minute. The silence of the Appalachian night pressed in on us, heavy and cold. No messages. No missed calls. He was the loose end she'd hoped I would tie for her. He looked at me, and I saw the realization hit him the same crushing weight I'd felt in the pharmacy. He dropped the bolt cutters. They hit the wood with a heavy, final thud. I got nowhere to go, man, he muttered, his shoulders slumping. The people I owe, they aren't as patient as you. Then I suggest you start riding, I said, pointing toward the driveway. The state troopers are going through Susan's digital files as we speak. Your name is all over those DP Holdings transfers. You have about an hour before they come looking for you. If I were you, I'd head for the state line and never look back. Derek didn't argue. He didn't even look at me again. He turned, stumbled down the stairs, and climbed onto that black motorcycle. A moment later, the engine roared to life, a desperate, frantic sound that tore through the quiet of Maple Ridge. I watched his taillights disappear into the darkness, the red glow fading until there was nothing left but the wind in the trees. I was finally, truly alone. I walked back inside and locked the door, not out of fear, but for the sake of ceremony. I walked through the kitchen, past the shattered crystal and the scattered bank statements. I went down into the basement, to the corner where Martha's old cedar chest sat under a heavy tarp. I'd avoided this corner for 3 years. Susan had wanted to modernize the basement, which was her code for throwing away the past. I'd fought her on it, one of the few times I'd stood my ground, and now I knew why. I pulled back the tarp and opened the chest. The scent of cedar and dried lavender filled the air, a sweetness that cut through the lingering smell of Susan's perfume. Inside were the things that actually mattered. Martha's journals, my grandfather's watch, and a small blue velvet box I'd forgotten existed. I opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band and a folded piece of paper. It was a note Martha had written me 10 years ago, when we'd finally paid off the mortgage on this house. Stuart, it read in her neat, schoolteacher's script. Today we own the dirt, the walls, and the roof. But remember, the value isn't in the deed, it's in the man who worked for it. You are the strongest person I know, not because of your muscles, but because of your heart. Stay true to the earth, and it will always hold you up. I sat on the cold concrete floor and cried. I didn't cry for the $80,000. I didn't cry for the betrayal. I cried for the man I'd almost let them kill, the man Martha had loved. I realized then that the pension Susan had tried to steal wasn't just money. It was my dignity. It was my history. The months that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and quiet reconstruction. The trial was a circus, a local headline that stayed on the front page for weeks. The Miner and the Black Widow Syndicate. Vincent Vane took a plea deal, testifying against Susan and Dorothy in exchange for a lighter sentence. Dorothy, ever the cold strategist, tried to blame the whole thing on Susan's instability. But the digital mirror logs Leo had captured were undeniable. Susan was sentenced to 10 years for grand larceny, insurance fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Lydia got 5 years of probation and a mountain of community service. Her influencer lifestyle replaced by a bright orange vest and a trash picker on the side of the highway. Derek Palmer was never found, though rumors persisted that he'd fled to Vegas or ended up in a ditch somewhere in Ohio. The state insurance board launched an investigation into the forged policy. Because the premiums had been paid with my own stolen funds, they couldn't just keep the money. They issued a refund for every cent of the premiums. Susan had paid a check for nearly $12,000. It wasn't the $80,000 I'd lost, but it was enough to fix the roof and replace the tools she'd sold. I didn't retire, not yet. I went back to the mine for one more year. I wanted to leave on my own terms, not as a victim, but as a man who still had work to do. My crew treated me with a quiet, somber respect. They knew I'd faced a different kind of cave-in and walked out on my own 2 feet. On my 63rd birthday, I finally turned in my badge. I walked out of the pit head for the last time, the afternoon sun feeling warmer than it ever had before. I didn't look back at the mountain. I looked forward, at the road leading back to my rancher. Today is a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year since the court hearing. The air is crisp, the maples on my street a riot of orange and gold. I'm sitting on my porch swing, a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, the expensive kind, because I can afford it now. The house is quiet, but it's a full quiet. Marcus is coming over later. We're going to work on a new project in the workshop. A dining table, solid oak, something meant to last a lifetime. I look at the empty driveway where the silver Cadillac and the red Mazda used to sit. The space is filled with sunlight now. I'm 63 years old. I've lost a lot of things. I've lost money, I've lost time, and I've lost the hearing in my left ear to the roar of the machines. But as I watch the cardinals flitting around the red birdhouse in the oak tree, I realize I've gained the one thing no scam could ever touch. I know exactly what I'm worth. And in this town, under this sky, on this dirt that I own heart and soul, that is more than enough. I take a sip of my coffee and let the swing rock gently. The mountain is still there, ancient and unmoving, but I'm no longer digging for a future. I'm living in it. The story of the Donnelly cave-in is over. The rebuilding, however, has just begun. And as the old miners used to say when they reached the end of a long, dark shift, the light is better when you've earned it in the dark. I've earned my light, and I plan to enjoy every single ray of it.